I will begin talking about The Shining in 139 seconds, but first, a comparison of cinema to sound and a statement on horror in cinema. I find jump scares to be pointless for the most part. It is a destination with no journey, with zero attack, minimum decay, no sustain, and zero release. For synthesizers, these terms are used to describe the envelope of sound itself, and I find this metaphor fits with horror perfectly because it shows the general shape of a conflict arc. There's the beginning, or exposition, followed by the rising action, where it peaks in volume at the climax before either falling or releasing to the resolution. So for horror, picture the beginning as being quiet, because nothing is going on. However, you know where the film should end up. This, however, is drawn out for a long time. If done successfully, you don't get bored of this drawn out action because there's not only some anticipation to it, but as more time passes, a greater crescendo is expected. And if such a crescendo is met or even exceeded, then the wait was worth it. Otherwise, if there's a very boring build-up that suddenly gets loud, then goes back to being quiet, well, I myself feel unsatisfied by this. My argument, to put it as concisely as possible, think about what is going on in Stairway to Heaven. It begins with a very quiet A minor arpeggio by Jimmy Page in the left ear before ending with one of rock music's most famous solos, one final verse, and Robert Plant giving one last statement. Alfred Hitchcock's entire career is based on the idea of suspense. It isn't necessarily an impending doom, but knowing something bad will happen can last longer than a door opening and out jumps a clown. The fact it lasts longer has the potential for a greater impact because instead of being scared for 3 seconds, the minutes spent seeing the slow approach to doom is more impactful. The genius of Psycho isn't because Norman Bates kills a woman in the shower, though this is the most famous scene from the film. The genius is the slow approach to Marion Crane's death, from her taking the money, to driving into the desert, to reaching a motel in the middle of nowhere, and ending with feeling safe in the Bates motel. Alfred Hitchcock died in late April of 1980. In his lifetime, he directed many films. Rear Window, North by Northwest, The Birds, Psycho, The Man Who Knew Too Much. These are but few in his vast filmography. The master of suspense passed away 24 days before Americans got to see The Shining on the silver screen. From the start, The Shining begins with almost any common horror trope: the woods, the wilderness, and a lone car on a lone road. A synth drone courtesy of Wendy Carlos as it transitions into the very feeling of spiders on your back. Without a doubt, the film tells you before the credits have even rolled, you better be watching this in a dark room. This is the opening that has spawned over 40 years of discussion, theories, and various criticism for the performances of not just the actors, but the director as well. I remember the first time I watched The Shining and being blown away by how perfect this film felt. Before The Shining, I did not have a horror film really that I thought was particularly great. Children of the Corn was one of the first I ever saw, and it's so fucking laughable watching that film that I honestly have to view it as more of a dark comedy than a scary horror film. Perhaps the closest film to being my favorite horror film was The Silence of the Lambs. Maybe deserving of its own video in the future, but it was The Shining and not Silence of the Lambs that not only became my favorite horror film, but my favorite film period. In loose terms, it did everything I wanted from a horror film. It focused on the psychology of horror, how the mind plays tricks to turn what is simply a hotel into something much more perverted. The story itself wasn't a dumb story. The premise might be simple, but it wasn't something that was explicitly trying to be flashy from the start. Then, to top it off, when the film needed to be scary, it did it almost infinitely better than most of the horror films I had seen up to that point. However, on the first watch, it is very easy to miss so many details. I distinctly remember getting into a conversation with my dad because it seemed like we had somehow watched 2 different films. I said that everything in the film happened in the heads of the characters, but he said it was just a haunted house film. The two aren't mutually exclusive, but this thought has stuck with me for years because it feels strange to reduce this film down to something as simple as a haunted house film. After all, there's themes of domestic violence, a man trying to make it in the world, the very nature of isolation, especially in the mountains of Colorado in the winter. Thus, I came to realize there was far more to this film than even I had picked up on. on. This month I watched The Shining for the third time, the first in at least 2 years, and this time paid close attention to every shot, every character movement, every line of dialogue, every musical cue, every camera motion, every contradiction, every time the film cut to black to go forward in time, and took note of everything in a document. After doing this, I have found that even my original script for this video is insufficient because I wrote off an entire part of this film that I now realize is far more important than I ever thought. There are 6 actors that have prominent roles in this film, however I will mostly be focusing on just 4 of them. Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, Danny Lloyd, Scatman Crothers, Barry Nelson, and Philip Stone. The first 4 I am more concerned with, but no doubt these other 2 characters played by Barry Nelson and Philip Stone play critical roles in this story, and as such, their performances are just as important. As Mr. Ullman, Barry Nelson's only responsibilities for performing this character are to be the owner of the hotel and deliver the story of the twisted history of the Overlook Hotel. The former mostly consists of him giving Jack and his family a tour, but the latter is very important. Let me use this opportunity to outline 3 ways of watching The Shining. 1. This is a film about a haunted hotel with the spirit that possesses, at a minimum, Jack. AKA everything that happens in this film is supernatural. 2. Jack planned to murder his family. 3. There was a psychological break to each of these characters that triggered all the events in this film. In other words, everything we see is a hallucination or the results of hallucinations. In the case of the haunted hotel story, there is typically a need to establish the mythos of a location so as to make it seem haunted. A graveyard or a hospital may inherently have this because, as a human, you know where you are. You know exactly what a graveyard is or how sometimes people die in hospitals. But if you're just walking through a field, well, it's not going to have the same ring to it. That is, of course, unless you learn you're walking where Gettysburg or Verdun happened. Or maybe this was a native tribe's former burial ground. I do not know how I never noticed this, but 20 minutes into the film, Mr. Ullman is giving a tour of the outside of the hotel and mentions how the hotel was built between 1907 and 1909. He also just happens to gloss over the fact that this hotel was built on an American native burial ground. Yeah, so let's get the facts straight real quick. Burial ground. White man builds hotel. Kills more natives because they start attacking the construction workers. Then 60 years later, assuming there were no other instances where someone was killed in this hotel, an entire family is slaughtered by the father, and this happens again 7 years later. Yeah, nothing suspicious about that. So after watching this a 3rd time, I was surprised to find all these clues hinting at some kind of spirit of the house that wants the people who enter it to die. I think this is then made more clear with even the Gold Room. Joe Turkel plays Lloyd the bartender. In these 2 scenes in the Gold Room, I think a further argument towards this being a haunted house film becomes clear. In the second Gold Room scene, we meet Delbert Grady. Grady and Lloyd are going to be very important, and I will explain why later, but for right now, just remember that for the haunted hotel angle, they're tied to whatever supernatural force is present in the hotel. Let's switch to a premeditated murder angle and start by talking about Jack, who plays Jack Torrance. This is not the first, and it is not the last time Jack Nicholson plays a crazy character. Crazy is a very fine line to perform, of which Jack Nicholson is able to walk with what feels like little effort. To me, I could see both a stable man and unstable man in his performance in just the beginning of the film alone. If you know how the film ends, then it can be difficult to not believe Jack Torrance is lying in these scenes. On one hand, he may be planning to kill his family, while on the other, he may just be trying to get a job. I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt and say Jack Torrance is someone who is trying to make it big as an author, but he has his own problems. He's a recovering alcoholic who has previously treated his family terribly. He has acknowledged this and is on the road to recovery. This is the best case for this character, while the worst case is, in fact, him wanting to kill his family. For instance, there's this moment in the film where they're driving to the hotel, but everyone in the car is very uncomfortable. Jack is easily irritated by his family, even though one would think this is supposed to be, in effect, a paid vacation for them. On the other hand, perhaps everyone in the car is just anxious. Of course, things get much worse as the film progresses. Shelley Duvall, in my opinion, gives the best performance out of anyone in this film. Her performance is comparable to an endurance run because in every single scene she isn't able to relax, and if I dare say, she carries this film on her shoulders. There's a couple exceptions, but she is always giving the performance of the character of a woman trapped in this dire situation. In every scene, it is clear Wendy Torrance is a mother looking out for the well-being of her son and husband, even as the insidious nature of this abuse becomes ever more clear. It is incredible, really, how one would think such a performance would be straining and would drive someone to insanity. There's hardly a moment where Jack Torrance doesn't look like he's 2 steps removed from killing Wendy, and there's hardly a moment where Wendy doesn't look scared of her husband. Even when Mr. Ullman shows them to their living quarters in the hotel, there was this shot that felt off to me. Watch this fade away and tell me if you feel like something is off.
This is our famous...
Then there's Danny. Danny fits into any of these 3 ways of watching this film. The problem is, he fits almost perfectly into each. Now, with Dick Halloran, the head chef of the Overlook Hotel, you can see more of the supernatural element between the two because both of them share the power that Dick calls the Shining.
She called it shining.
To me, The Shining can be a supernatural thing such as like fortune telling or tarot. However, I think there is a psychological element to it as well, which I will discuss much later on. Both the supernatural and psychological approaches are important to note here because Danny is at the center of it. It is my belief that Danny is a traumatized kid because of his father, so in any case, he is either using this power for survival or for escape. For each angle of the film I have presented, I am going to walk through the film based on each angle. Afterwards, I will then present my interpretation of the film. However, let me emphasize that these are only 3 of the many possible interpretations of this film. This is one of the reasons why this used to be my favorite film, because there's so much to discuss. There are so many ways of looking at scenes that there is something different that can be interpreted no matter what. The Overlook Hotel was constructed on a burial ground in 1907 and finished in 1909. Even during its long construction, several people died, tainting the land with further blood. Over the years, many people have died in the hotel from different causes. Not all are necessarily nefarious, but the one that stands out in recent memory is the Grady Massacre. A caretaker was hired to look after the hotel during its off-season, and in 1970, it was a man by the name of Charles Grady. Charles Grady killed his wife and 2 daughters, then blew his head off in a murder-suicide, leaving it for the owners to discover what happened just months later. Fast forward to 1977. The newly renovated Overlook Hotel is looking to hire another caretaker for the off-season. Here they hire Jack Torrance, who, with his wife and son, move into the hotel at the end of October to stay until the beginning of May. Everything is fine for about a month, though Danny Torrance, the little boy, thinks he sees some things while living here. Eventually, while the family begins having nightmares, a demonic spirit manages to grab hold of Danny. Wendy, being concerned for her son, believes that only Jack could have hurt Danny. Jack, now pissed off, begins walking around the hotel where he runs into Lloyd, the bartender. Lloyd may or may not have existed, but either way, he is somehow connected to the hotel's spirit, if you will. Furthermore, he is a bit of a devil archetype, as I believe Jack does make a deal with him, of which the price is Jack's soul and the release of all evil in this hotel. Hell, before Lloyd appears, Jack says,
Anything for a drink? Get my goddamn soul. Just a glass of beer.
there are not supposed to be any spirits on the grounds of the hotel during its off-season, as is stated so in the beginning of the film. The spirit of the hotel conjures a bottle of Jack Daniels whiskey that Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson, drinks out of after he is accused of hurting his son, Daniel, all for the simple price of his soul. Wendy interrupts the scene by saying there was a crazy woman in the hotel who grabbed Danny previously. Jack goes to investigate, and as it turns out, there's a woman in room 237. You just can't see her because this is YouTube, and YouTube claims they don't allow titties on their platform. At this point, if you are following the film from this angle, the most haunting thing to happen is about to occur, in which we learn Jack Torrance probably has an even scarier face when Jack. From this point onward, what is seen is both Jack and Danny becoming possessed by the hotel. This is when Danny begins repeating Red Rum, while Jack becomes Johnny, etc, etc. Despite the efforts of the hotel, it could not wipe out Wendy and Danny, but it did get Jack and Dick. I think why this version of events is appealing is because it is the most straightforward if you're paying attention purely to the dialogue and setting. Keep in mind, the idea of what horror films were at this time would have been things like 1973's The Exorcist, 1974's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or 1979's Alien, along with 1978's Halloween as an honorable mention. These films have very standard premises, whereas nowadays there's maybe a few more unorthodox ideas that are built off of the same old ideas. This is the fundamental basis of what the story of The Shining is. This is the most fantastical because it does play on humanity's desire for the supernatural. In a purely secular approach, a building is nothing more than a building. At one point, it may have been where a famous actress committed suicide, or an old man fell ill, or someone murdered their family. However, those events are no more because of the temporal nature of time. The spirits themselves don't exist. However, this isn't how humans typically view things, or else battlegrounds wouldn't be sacred, or the birthplace and deathplace of famous people wouldn't be as interesting. Now let me present something completely different. Jack Torrance was going to commit murder and get away with it. The thing that makes The Silence of the Lambs scary is Hannibal Lecter is smart and is a psychiatrist. This means he has a very good understanding of human behavior and can make fairly accurate predictions on how his victims will behave. The idea that someone may know you better than yourself does progressively get scarier the more you think about it. My point here is, despite Hannibal Lecter not being the main antagonist per se, he is undoubtedly the scariest part of The Silence of the Lambs for not just being a cannibal, but because he knows people too well. Jack Torrance in this angle knows what he is doing. He doesn't like his family, and in fact views them as holding him back. It is clear from the start there's a rift between him and his wife. When he goes to get the job, he doesn't bat an eye at the story of Charles Grady until Mr. Ullman says Grady blew his head off.
Well, that is quite a story.
Maybe Jack saw himself in that story, and that was why he was notably put off. In short, I think he has a plan that he wants to go through with. Though, perhaps we should actually begin with Wendy's conversation with this doctor. I'm not saying every alcoholic wants to kill their family. I'm not saying every recovering alcoholic wants to kill their family. In my interpretation of this film, I think Jack Torrance was being genuine and becoming a better man up to when his psyche began to crack. For this angle, however, I think we may be long past that. Among many common background stories for a tragedy happening, domestic abuse tends to be a common one. In the case of the Torrance family, Wendy downplays what Jack did to Danny. However, later on in the Gold Room, Jack disputes this and unintentionally paints an even worse picture of what happened, either 5 months ago or 3 years ago. I do not think, for this way of viewing The Shining, that this was the only thing that happened. I think much more happened, and in fact, I think there are things that Wendy is choosing not to say. Whatever these things are, they are the early signs of and the events leading up to the tragedy that is being planned. One of the most telling moments is when Jack snaps at Wendy when she checks on how he's doing with his writing. He says that she is interrupting him and is ruining his ability to write.
Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me, and it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
I think Jack wants to be a successful author. Perhaps when Stephen King originally wrote this, there was a little bit of him he wrote into Jack Torrance. When The Shining came out in 1977, it was only King's third published book. Either way, this striving for success is feeding into a perfectionist mentality, which in turn dictates some of Jack's reactions. Combined with his hatred of Wendy, it makes sense why this scene happens. Think like a murderer for a moment. Why not go to a secluded hotel in the mountains? Why not have almost half the year to be isolated from the rest of the world? Why not have the perfect alibi for plausible deniability of his family going missing? What if, say, there was a freak accident at the hotel where it burnt down? Only Jack made it out. Now he no longer has his family, so he is free from his obligations to Wendy and Danny, but now gets a sob story of a lifetime to write a book about. It is disturbing, no doubt, but it is completely possible. Unfortunately, it isn't a unique occurrence for someone to write an autobiographical piece, peddle it as the truth, and completely lie. One example I learned of. There was a woman who lied about surviving the September 11th attacks. This lie was exposed with the New York Times reporting on it in September of 2007. For 6 years, this lie worked in full swing. From this lie, she gained a lot of notoriety for her work with the World Trade Center Survivors Network, a non-profit she was president of. I am not here to comment on the Survivors Network as I know nothing about them. However, it is egregious to lie about surviving September 11th, and for what? Clout? Whether she made money off of this or not is up for debate, and while she didn't publish a book about her so-called account, a book was published debunking her story. So I only bring this up because much worse has been laid to paper. The idea for someone to kill their family and write about it is disgusting, but has likely happened before, and therefore I cannot see it as being too far of a concept from reality. Therefore, The Shining is a film about Jack Torrance plotting the murder of his family. He abuses his family while he schemes and prepares for the perfect murder. For the most part, it follows Wendy's perspective, with times where we see the inner psyche of Jack. All the shit in the gold room didn't happen. Instead, Jack hid a bottle of liquor somewhere in their luggage and was able to bring it. He's been hiding his consumption of alcohol, albeit perhaps he is consuming much less than he used to. I imagine it can't be that difficult to fit a bottle of Jack Daniels somewhere in all this luggage they brought, but by the end, Wendy and Danny manage to escape with their lives, but unfortunately for Dick Hallorann, he is Jack's only victim, and of course, Jack dies at the end of the film. You know, I want to briefly comment on that. Before rewatching this film, one of my criticisms of Dick Hallorann was that I didn't think he was a necessary character to the story, except for bringing the snowcat for Wendy and Danny to escape. It was too plot convenient to me that Jack, being a moron, decided to break the snowcat and Mr. Hallorann shows up with a new one. I wrote off the whole Shining thing in this film because it seemed like total bullshit to me. However, after watching this film for a third time, I realized that Dick Hallorann is actually pretty important to the story, and even if I write off the supernatural Shining element, it still makes a lot of sense why this man would come to the rescue and not anyone else. So, because of that change in opinion, I'm also joining many other people in their criticisms of this aspect of the film. There really wasn't a reason for Dick Hallorann to die in Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining. The only reason why is for cinema, because the fact is that no one except Jack Torrance dies in this film otherwise. Now, apparently Dick Hallorann survives in Stephen King's original novel. This is a topic I don't want to get into because I have not read any Stephen King book, much less The Shining. I have a personal policy where I either read the book or watch the film. I don't typically do both. I might elaborate on that later, but that's a decision I've tended to stand by. For this video, I only care about Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining because I am talking about the film, not the book. I agree that ultimately whatever Stephen King wrote is the correct telling of events because he's the fucking author after all. But if Mr. Hallorann survives in the novel, then what the fuck was Stanley Kubrick thinking? Editor's note, I still have not read this book in its entirety, however I did read the ending and not only does Dick Hallorann survive, but there's so much other shit that happens in the ending that seems to hint at other things happening in the book that did not happen in the film. Long and short, this is why I pick either the film or the book. Back to the video. Ultimately in the film, it still doesn't make sense why Dick Hallorann just walks into the hotel, knowing damn well something is wrong, and then just stands there as Jack buries a hatchet into his chest. I've presented two different ways of looking at The Shining, and now I want to present my way, which I believe lies in the middle of these two perspectives. Why I love this film so much is because of what I am showing you right now, as this film's entirety is well beyond the sum of its parts. The Shining is built off of the strong foundation of Stephen King's original novel and his ability to write horror. It is constructed with the incredible performances by its cast and the cinematic vision of its director. Lastly, it is enhanced by its score, pulling from the work of Wendy Carlos and Krzysztof Penderecki. As a result of pulling from these amazing talents and the hard work and passion of everyone involved, this film is the most interesting film I've ever seen, because there is no one way of looking at it, nor is there one single answer for anything. It is good to feel uncomfortable in horror, and in every shot with Jack Torrance, there's always a bit of discomfort one can feel, no matter how small. There's always a bit of dread whenever we follow Danny Torrance through the halls of the Overlook, even when nothing happens. No matter what, there is a feeling of concern for Wendy Torrance's well-being, and by the end of the film, we want to see her make it out alive. Jack Torrance, a former school teacher from Vermont, moved his family to Colorado. A couple months later, he is driving on a mountain road to the Overlook Hotel where he plans to take up the reins as the hotel's caretaker. After a successful interview, he moves his family to the hotel the following day. The family is given a tour of the hotel, and eventually they meet the hotel's head chef, Mr. Dick Hallorann, who also gives them a tour. This brings us to a conversation between Mr. Hallorann and Danny Torrance, Jack and Wendy's son. Dick talks about a sixth sense that he has and his grandma used to have, which he believes Danny also has. The grandmother called it the shining, saying that some people have a shine to them. Even some places have a shine to them. In fact, this might be some kind of connection to the paranormal or supernatural in a similar vein to things like tarot cards. But in my opinion, the more realistic explanation comes down to gut feelings. There's a brief mention of a room 237, which Dick insists isn't anything special.
What is in room 237?
Nothing. There ain't nothing in room 237. But you ain't got no business going in there anyway. So stay out. You understand? Stay out.
A month later, the family has settled into life in the Overlook Hotel. Things are normal for a while, but the isolation of living in this hotel is slowly chipping away at the family. Jack has been spending every day riding, sparing no time to spend with his family, while Wendy and Danny have been spending plenty of time together. Though, by Tuesday, the cracks begin to form. Jack lashes out at Wendy for interrupting his work, and while it is far from the most violent thing Jack will do in this film, it is the first sign of things to come. Let's stop here for just a moment to analyze what I've presented thus far. There is a seed of doubt in each member of the family, on top of any doubts they may already have. Wendy and Jack are both aware of the haunted nature of the hotel, so this is one of their seeds. Danny's seed of doubt comes from his interaction with Dick Halloran. Before this, there existed more seeds of doubt, all of which came from Jack. Jack's own self-worth hinges on the success of his riding career because, prior to this, he was an abusive alcoholic. I think he is trying to move away from that genuinely, and I think he believes that by turning what he has wanted to do for years into a viable career, may prove to his family and to society that he is more than an alcoholic and abusive father. However, Jack's past actions have not been forgotten by his wife and son. Wendy is holding out in hope for her husband to become a better man, but not really because she has an option. She is simply trapped with her husband because, after all, what is she going to do? Does she have parents to fall back on? It doesn't really seem like she has any friends. Hell, they've moved 1,500 miles from Vermont, so it would be difficult for her to move back. We know she can't just leave her son either, and hell, if she does leave Jack and takes Danny, then what's next? She is fully dependent on Jack. As for Danny, he has grown up seeing all of this. So what would a small child's perception of his father's abuse look like? Perhaps he doesn't have the vocabulary to express what he knows, but the child is far from ignorant of what is going on. Continuing on, by Saturday, Wendy learns a winter storm is coming, which will further isolate them from the rest of the world as they will become trapped in the hotel. On this day, Danny is riding around the hotel and happens to come across two girls who he saw a month prior. This time, the two girls, who for some reason are British, are definitely not violently dismembered in this YouTube video. Monday, Danny goes to get a toy from his room while trying not to wake up his father, but his father is awake, simply staring out a window. There's a moment between the two where Danny innocently asks,
You would never hurt Mommy or me, would ya?
Wednesday, one of the most famous shots of the film. Room 237 is open and Danny walks in. Next shot, Wendy is in the boiler room when she hears Jack screaming. Jack had a nightmare where he killed his family, and to Danny with marks on his neck and shoulder. Pause. The seeds of doubt I mentioned before have grown. Wendy thinks Jack did it. Jack doesn't know what happened, and Danny keeps seeing things. Oh, and I haven't mentioned Tony yet.
Tony? I'm scared.
Tony is Danny's imaginary friend who happens to know everything that is going on. He can see Jack getting the job. He is there to reassure Danny that the girls are not real, and he eventually possesses Danny in the last third of the film. The question now is, where does Tony fall into all of this? In my opinion, he isn't a supernatural thing in this film, but instead some kind of coping mechanism for Danny. Like I said, Danny may not have the vocabulary to speak out against what is going on, but he sure as fuck knows what he's seeing. I now want to put these two shots together and see if you notice anything. Do you see how Jack is holding Danny? This doesn't feel like a detail Kubrick wouldn't have included in the film if it didn't mean something. If this was written in the original book, then this is absolutely a very important detail. But either way, we now have to open the door to room 237. Room 237 is the biggest mystery of The Shining simply because nothing is seen of room 237 from Danny's point of view. Something did happen in room 237 on Wednesday. From the haunted hotel perspective, there was a woman who attacked Danny. From the murder perspective, perhaps there was something involving Jack. Maybe Jack planned to kill Danny but failed to do so. However, from the psychological perspective I'm presenting here, I really don't know what to fully make of this because of the physical marks left on Danny. I think somehow by him entering 237, he remembered the abuse of his father from just months prior. However, this doesn't answer how the hell there were these marks left on his neck and shoulder. Though, I do have one potential idea since I don't think we can be too sure about Jack's placement during this time. One possible theory I can think of, which I cannot fully believe, is maybe Jack did something while he was sleeping. Maybe something like Fight Club. That could explain things, and hell, we are aware of Jack not sleeping well by this point. Best answer I can think of is Jack, while sleeping, tried to do something to Danny, and from the looks of things perhaps tried to strangle him. With that said, I don't fully believe this for the simple fact that Wendy should have heard something. She only hears Jack screaming, but not Danny. For me, this is one piece of the puzzle that is difficult to make sense of. From these accusations, Jack takes a walk through the hotel and ends up at the bar in the Gold Room. Thus begins a sequence of several important scenes in the story. Let's first talk about Jack's alcoholism. There should be no bottle of alcohol in the hotel, yet somehow there is. Very simple explanation, Jack brought it with him. I don't see it impossible for him to have bought the bottle of Jack and hid it somewhere in his car. Then when they arrive and move in, he puts it in the Gold Room, under the counter. I doubt Wendy or Danny would ever go looking through his bar, so to me, I think this is the best hiding place for Jack's whiskey. He then forgets about it for a month, which is why he says,
My goddamn soul. Just a glass of beer.
He then maybe finds the bottle and pours himself a drink. During this time, he hallucinates his interaction with Lloyd. Wendy interrupts his drinking and tells him what happened. Now loosened with some alcohol in him, he envisions both the green bathroom scene and the red bathroom scene. The former represents his wish to be with someone other than Wendy, while the latter is what brings him to his decision to kill his family. Delbert Grady, who for some reason is British, tells Jack that Jack has always been the caretaker of the Overlook Hotel. Of note, Delbert Grady should actually be Charles Grady, because Mr. Ullman talks about Charles Grady caring for the hotel. However, he is the same person either way, because who else would be the father of 2 British daughters and have a wife seducing Jack Nicholson? But either way, this is Jack coming to believe he, as the caretaker, must follow in the footsteps of the previous caretaker and murder his family. This justification is loose, as it is simply his way of justifying his desire to murder his family, but it is what it is in the story. What doesn't entirely make sense with my way of viewing the film is how Jack knows Dick Halloran will come to save Wendy and Danny. Mr. Grady tells him indirectly, using a certain word I won't repeat, and Jack gets the hint. In reality, I think there's reason for Jack to suspect it is Mr. Halloran who will come to Wendy and Danny's rescue and not, say, Mr. Ullman, because he is aware of Mr. Halloran's time spent with Danny when they got there a month prior. Therefore, maybe either because he didn't remember the man's name or out of racism, decided to just refer to him as That now brings us to Dick Halloran. While he would claim that he can sense Danny's duress, I think Dick Halloran feels some kind of guilt. Simply put, this behavior can be justified by him having a gut feeling something was off. It's like if your friend was on a plane going across the country to LAX, and it just so happens on the same day a plane crashes in Nevada. Out of panic, you might try to call your friend to ensure they're still alive and safe. But if they're still in the air and will be there for another hour, then they won't be answering their phone right away. Dick tries to call the hotel, but there's no connection because of the snow. He calls the Forest Service, who tries to connect to the hotel, to which there's no response. For all he knows, there could be a perfectly sound reason and nothing has gone wrong. Either way, he gets a plane ticket to Denver. The next important scene is what some call the staircase scene or the typewriter scene. Either way, it refers to this incredible sequence. I fucking love the camera work in this whole scene. The slow reveal of what has been written by Jack, combined with Shelley Duvall's performance, combined with this back and forth cutting of the camera between Jack and Wendy. I didn't realize this until rewatching the film, but these two camera angles are essentially first-person perspective shots. As soon as I realized that, it made this whole scene so much better. From what I can tell, this scene is not one single performance off of one take. It is at minimum cutting between 2 different takes. On top of that, this would have required so many different takes to get right, much less the one take that was satisfactory for Stanley Kubrick. The added strain of repeated takes possibly compounded on the actors, making this performance feel as believable as it does. This is genuinely amazing, and is worth watching this whole film just for this sequence. But with that said, as we now approach the home stretch of the film, this is where Wendy finally defends herself. She has decided she is going to do what she needs to do for her son, even if it means knocking the shit out of Jack and locking him into a food storage room. Now for the highlights of the ending of the film. Danny, while still possessed by Tony, writes red rum on the bathroom door with lipstick and scares the shit out of Wendy. Of course, there's the most famous shot from the film.
Here's Johnny!
Followed by Dick conveniently appearing to save the day, only to get axed by Jack. There's a variety of bizarre as hell events that scare the fuck out of Wendy, but is all in her mind. Still though, I'm not too sure the furry sex scene was necessary. Danny outsmarts Jack when he chases him into a maze and manages to escape. He and Wendy then get into the snowcat and leave the hotel. The final shot of the film sees the camera dolly forward to a wall of pictures. After the calm, after the storm, and after they retreat to safety, the final statement of the film is presented. July 4th Ball, 1921. True to the character of the film, it asks one final question. Was the hotel haunted and there were actually war ghosts living in the hotel? Or was it all in the family's heads? Was Jack always the caretaker, or is this one final metaphor for how he saw himself as the caretaker of the Overlook Hotel? Either way, the abuses of Jack to his family and his path of destruction will forever last on Wendy and Danny, and just as the past abuses of Mr. Grady, so too will the Overlook Hotel reopen while hiding the events that unfolded in these empty halls. The BBC published a documentary behind-the-scenes film about the making of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. The documentary only focuses on production itself and seems to show a very limited time period out of all of production. What makes this film so fascinating is not only the direct look it gives into the production of The Shining, but the fact it was created by Vivian Kubrick. Making The Shining feels fairly standard from the beginning for a behind-the-scenes film. You see the actors practicing their lines while their makeup is being applied, conversations about problems on sets, and even how some shots were set up. Overall, it is pretty informative of how film sets operate. The most noteworthy component of this documentary, however, is Stanley Kubrick's treatment of Shelley Duvall. Many people may already be aware of this, but Shelley Duvall was treated like total shit by Stanley Kubrick while working on this film. Duvall explains that due to stress during production and a number of things happening in her life at the time, she was going in and out of the hospital.
So for me, it was just tumultuous.
There's another moment where chunks of her hair fell out due to the stress being involved with the film.
Hunks of hair out on the windowsill, and the back got cut.
Need you trim that.
Hunks of hair.
Oh, look.
Okay.
And Stanley Kubrick was dismissive of it.
Well, I don't sympathize with Shelley.
There's another moment where he's very dismissive of her input on how she should perform a page of the script.
He lays down.
No, I think that line's in the right place.
Okay, Shelley, so you say, what's the matter with you first?
Because what's the matter with you means, why are you so angry? What is the matter with you? What are you talking about?
Well, this is where he lays down, though. That's the only thing I was thinking of. You know, when he flops back on the bed. Since that is new, I thought it fit, you know, what's the matter with you?
If you talk
And then he
say
blows
this
up.
right, I'd rather say it now. Honestly, don't think the lines are going to make an awful lot of difference if you get the right attitude. I think you're worrying about the wrong thing.
My problem with all of this is just how clear it is that none of this is healthy for Shelley Duvall, and to single her out as the reason production isn't going well is far from professional. In my opinion, her performance is what ultimately made this film. I praised everyone else's performances, but there isn't The Shining, the masterpiece horror film directed by Stanley Kubrick, without Shelley Duvall as Wendy Torrance. Just as how I doubt anyone can imagine anyone else but Jack Nicholson hacking down a bathroom door with an axe, we must also acknowledge the importance of Shelley Duvall to this film. The shocking thing to me, however, is this all may have worked. Yes, Stanley Kubrick being horrible to Shelley Duvall and putting immense strain on everyone else may be why the performances are as good as they are. That is to say, even the actors give a lot of credit to Stanley Kubrick, basically saying that his control over production, while perhaps draconian, was what brought out these performances recorded to film.
He is doing exactly what he thinks he should be doing at that moment about it, you know, sort of very single-mindedly. He's emotional on the set, you know.
If it hadn't been for that, you know, volley of ideas and sometimes butting of heads together, it wouldn't have come out as good as it did. And it also helps get the emotion up and the concentration up, because it builds up anger, actually, and you get more out of yourself. And he knew that, and he knew he was getting more out of me by doing that. So it was sort of like a game.
Yet, I struggle to determine how justifiable this was, even if the actors seemed to be fine with it after the fact. In February of 2021, The Hollywood Reporter published an interview with Shelley Duvall, who since the 90s has practically fallen off the face of the earth. I was curious if her sentiment towards Stanley Kubrick has changed at all in the 41 years since the film came out. Surprisingly, she still looks at Stanley Kubrick fondly. Just 3 paragraphs later, a different story seems to be told. Seth Abramovich, who interviewed Duvall, writes about showing her the staircase scene from The Shining off of his phone, during which Duvall begins crying. I have and will continue to view The Shining as a film about domestic abuse that has certain supernatural elements to it. The problem in my eyes is that I cannot tell if I'm watching Shelley Duvall give one hell of a performance as Wendy Torrance, the abused wife, or if I'm seeing Shelley Duvall be abused by the film's director. In any case, while The Shining is definitely an incredible film, it hasn't been my favorite film since the 23rd of May, 2020. But that is for another video.